part of life is letting typewriters rust between poems. Much happens upon which poems depend. A wise poet knows without traveling, sees without looking, works without doing. All my life mourning doves have sung in my head. Don't misunderstand. This isn't some romantic notion about lost loves or martyring myself in the ocean. No, this is Ariadne's thread. It doesn't bind, it ravels all the wrappings of the shell I wove on worldly travels in the underworld. I mean, this song unwinds me. These birds lead to oneself, half in, half out of the sea. Something primal. Part water, part air breathing. Not of fin only, but also of wing. Morning doves have sung in my head all my life. Even now they sing. None of us had ever been where we were told to go. It's as if we had drifted to this place on some ghost raft and shed dreams like a corpse its skin. The beautiful parts of life can be the most desolate. Oil drops still rise from the Arizona. A rainbow clock ticks of death.
He is never without a pen, never without a poem. This is the story of Al Cahen, a self-proclaimed man cave dweller from Cleveland, a man who patiently awaits his muse in cafes, waiting rooms, in the basement office of his home. Amidst the clutter of his desk and overflowing shelves and stored boxes containing thousands of his poems and stories, his hungry mind steadily excavates new frontiers of thought. Teacher, writer, painter, poet. In his lair, Al is never alone. Soon to turn 80, Al Cahen shares his life, and following this interview, a tour of his home. Welcome to Souljourns. This interview was recorded in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, in February 2012. Al Cahen, one of my best friends in the whole cosmos, I think, not just Cleveland Heights, Ohio. It's such a delight. It's a dream come true. I wanted to have you as a captive prisoner in your little cave where your inspiration turns into poetry for a long, long time. And I finally have you here. Okay. So the trick is to allow you to just reveal anything about your inspiration, your muse, and your life that you would like to. So the first thing I'd like you to do is repeat what you just read to me that really focuses a light on the source of what I would call inspiration.
Yes, and it's something I encountered very recently, and it's affected me deeply. And it will continue to do that. It's from the Tao Tai Ching, and it's really a mantra. A wise poet knows without traveling, sees without looking, works without doing. Now that's something to live by.
And why does that specifically appeal to you so much?
It has nothing to do with channeling. It gets me into the heart of Tao Tai Ching, and it excites me and makes me feel that if I pay attention to this with every poem I write or revise, this will be beneficial.
So the number one question I always ask you is, if it's not channeling, and you've got thousands of poetic expressions and complete poems, where does it come from?
Well, if I say copper wires, does that make any sense?
Yeah, do you want to tell the story behind that?
Yes, I do. A good friend and myself had lunch one day in a Thai restaurant.
Yeah.
Happens to be in the room. And at lunch, we conjured up something that was, I think he started it, conjured up an endless copper wire, imaginary copper wire, that goes from the poet to who knows where or how far.
Maybe beyond the cosmos.
Beyond the cosmos. And that's an amazing visual picture for me. And it's also silent. So it doesn't, I'm not channeling it from the copper wire. I can't do that. And who is at the other end? I don't know. If I were a channeler, I would say, it's some old poet, an ancient poet, maybe composing it on the spot, but I don't care who's at the other end. I'm at one end. And something is happening in that copper wire that I can't describe. The only thing I can tell you is that it makes poems. It makes poems again and again and again.
I know you've thought about this for a long time, and I have too, and it's endlessly fascinating. So, considering the fact that you've explored what is that about, give me some ideas that maybe might explain better what's going on. Could it be like a current that's plugged into that charges your resource of creative expression? Could it be, if not channeling, maybe connecting one part of you to maybe Al's higher self? I mean, in effect, you'd be channeling to yourself. Or could it be something different?
That's a fascinating question. I'm not sure I can do much with it in a short time, but there's something about this wire that is feeling and not logic, and I can only express it through the poems that I write. And so it's influenced my work for the last 3 or 4 years in a way that I never had imagined. And it's made me, and this is very central, where does the line of poetry come from, or the first word in a poem, or the finished poem, or the revision of the poem? Well, it's coming from my brain. I don't dispute that at all. It's coming from my brain, but I don't know anything about my brain. It's also a mystery. Mm-hmm. And I assume that the other end of the copper wire has a much greater mystery about it. And if I'm a channeler in any peripheral way, it's because my brain is doing the channeling in a way that I can't feel and can't control.
So I know that the term channeler is not one of your favorite terms in the dictionary, to say the least. And yet what you're talking about is almost being a self-channeler.
That's a good way to put it. And that's wonderful.
I mean, the question is then, are you a scientist, which I know you are, trained as an engineer, to think of the brain as an engine, as a motor, a thoughtful heart, or do you term it in slightly different ways by referring to it as an organism of inspiration, and the sky's the limit? And these concepts come together, including your poetry, which you're going to read for us in a second. Mm-hmm. Just one last comment on that.
I can't explain a mystery. Mm-hmm. I cannot. If I could explain it, I wouldn't call it a mystery. I would elaborate on it. The poem's the only way I can get to the word of mystery and make sense out of it. So I'd like to start with one.
All right.
And my history of this poem begins when I was 10 years old with a 1940 Remington portable typewriter. And it just hooked me. for life. When I lived on Martha's Vineyard for 2 years, I typed several manuscripts, thousands of pages on that Royal portable, and when I moved back to Cleveland, I put it on a shelf, and only about 2 months ago did I take it out.
Oh, wow.
And it's full of dust and possibly parts, and I took it to a portable typewriter specialist who still has it, and it will come back reconditioned. And I will probably write some of my poems on it and push the computer aside and just see how it feels. And maybe that will be an answer, or a partial answer, to what the question you just asked.
It reminds me, before you start here, of a metaphor that's kind of vivid in my mind. Helga Sandberg, a friend of ours, gave us a pencil, a nub of a pencil, that her illustrious father, Carl Sandburg, would use, and being the miserly type that he was, he would never throw them away before he couldn't squeeze them into his little forefinger and thumb anymore. And she gave us a gift, one of his little stub of pencils with which she wrote poetry. And I wondered, I think it's in your possession now.
Yes.
If you had ever tried to write a poem with that pencil.
I did. In fact, I succeeded, and I lost the poem along with thousands of others. So I'll come across it again.
So you'll do the same thing with this old Remington.
Yes, that's a wonderful comparison. Yeah, absolutely.
Because it still has many poems in it.
When I did those thousands of typed pages, of course, I had no computer. This was pre-computer days. I'm talking about the early 80s. Mm-hmm. So
is this one of them that has its origins with that typewriter, or is this a newer poem?
This poem?
Yeah.
Well, let me read it. Space. Part of life is letting typewriters rust between poems. Much happens upon which poems depend. That's it. And I know you like this poem because I've read it.
Name the year for me. I started with your poetry group out at the place called the Pink Pig at Squire Valley View Farm when we met in the kitchen.
Sure.
Had to be 15 years ago, maybe
1989.
1989. A momentous year in my life for a lot of reasons.
Yes.
And when I heard you read that poem then, it changed my world, because it gave me a fresh look at why sometimes important instruments in our lives must remain mute and just sit collecting dust. And you explained that the typewriter that you were referring to in your poem had to occasionally remain mute, no keys struck, so that life could be lived from which future poems would emerge. In other words, you, Al, if I read you into the poem clearly enough, had to go on living your life instead of typing your poems, so that you could really have the impetus to come up with some crackerjack poetry in the future. And that makes as much sense to me today as it did then. And I didn't know the true origin of that story until now.
The interesting thing is, and I didn't make it clear to you, is that the pages, the thousands of pages that I typed and created to make manuscripts for a relationship with another artist, and as you know, I'm also an artist. And I didn't write a single poem on that typewriter in the 2 years I lived on the vineyard. It was all prose. Mm-hmm. But I had been writing poetry for a decade at that time. So getting that typewriter back, I think this time it's going to, it's been a long wait for a poem to be made. But
Having said all this, please read that poem one more time.
Space. Part of life is letting typewriters rust between poems. Much happens upon which poems depend.
And I'm intrigued by the title.
Space. Space. Typewriter space.
Literary space.
Literary space. Copper wire space.
Life lesson space.
Yes. Endless.
Expansive soul space.
You don't remember, but I read this poem in the group at one time, and you were present, and you liked it very much then. So,
well, I know for a fact we talked about this at least one time. If you didn't read it, we at least talked about it because I had 1,000 questions, and you were dutifully answering them back there when I was with you in '89 at the Pink Pig, week after week, and it's just a great experience in my life. And you shed a lot of light on the process of poetry. In fact, I'm trying to remember now, one of the key phrases you use to define poetry has something to do with the best form of self-revelation there is. Do you remember what you...
No, not directly.
But it made total sense to me that it was the clearest, most succinct form of self-revelation, meaning to me, as I understood, as you use words more or less like those, that all a poet does is continually dig deeper in revealing himself to himself.
Well, you've just enriched what I said a little while ago. My own brain is my channeler.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you're talking about.
It's your spade, your pick, your shovel, your wheelbarrow.
Yep.
And then eventually you get to sift through all the dust to get to the real gold.
Well put. It rings true.
Before we go on to the next poem, you told me just before turning on the camera the awesome number of thousands of pages that you've now believe you've written. And the question I asked you, which I never got a chance to hear your answer, do you have a guesstimate as to the number of poems you've written?
Very crude one. I'm going to say 3,000.
3,000. And I know you published at least 2 books of poetry years ago, decades ago.
Yes, I had a book published in 1966, and I had about 100 poems at that time in various little magazines throughout the country. So that's part of the publishing. Many chapbooks, some from our group, and others from John Carroll. I remember John Carroll Press, 18 consecutive issues had one of my poems in them. So they liked them. And then one day they said, that's enough.
And do you remember your first poem? And what inspired you?
With them?
No.
My first poem was in a cave across the road from Roxborough School when I was in the, I'm going to say, 7th grade, on a buddy, and we were smoking cigarettes in the cave. And I remember coming back and using 19th century language to say, air the winter clouds, and air this and air that. That was my first poem.
Oh, how wonderful.
But it was a start.
Yeah. But nonetheless, even though you were a budding poet and may not have realized it, you went into an academic pursuit after that school year experience of engineering, of science, and I don't often think of people with a science background making the huge leap into excavating the mind, as you've done. In other words, you left science and pursued your imagination, which cannot be scientifically verified.
And went to school to get another degree in English.
You went to Cahen, I believe?
To Carnegie.
Carnegie.
Carnegie Tech
Carnegie
as
Tech.
my undergraduate
And then
degree,
Case.
and Case Western Reserve.
Yeah.
Then Western Reserve.
And I think we've talked about this before. I'm trying to remember why you stopped pursuing the letters, your degree, because I think you already knew then that your life had a mission, a direction that you wanted to pursue with writing.
Well, I think what happened, Ted, is that I went back to that cave and remembered that poem and despised it. But the urge to write poetry began again then, and I did some plagiarism, good plagiarism, in senior high, and which cost me a terrible thrashing by the English teacher.
So somebody discovered you.
Yeah, well, the English teacher, and we were not friends.
Can you still defend your plagiarism?
No, I confessed it, and I said it was unconscious plagiarism.
Which
often occurs.
Which it was, yeah. I was enamored of the poem, and I, without knowing it, basically rewrote it.
Yeah. Prominent authors today are often exposed for having done the same thing. And their defense is the same thing. It's unconscious. And I think I understand why. I mean, you read so many wonderful ideas. You come across one from 9 years ago, and you're writing about a topic that might be similar today, and all of a sudden that idea springs back into your mind without remembering how to attribute it to its source, whether it was your idea or somebody else's idea.
Good point. That's happened to me many, many times.
Oh, I think it happens to all of us.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the next poem.
Okay.
What's it called?
Evocation. Or is it evocation?
Depending on what part of the...
This poem was done in the 70s. This is an oldie. But it's stuck with me ever since. It's probably one of my 3 favorite poems. And it has to do with childhood memories of mourning doves. Evocation. All my life mourning doves have sung in my head. Don't misunderstand. This isn't some romantic notion about lost loves or martyring myself in the ocean. No, this is Ariadne's thread. It doesn't bind, it ravels all the wrappings of the shell I wove on worldly travels in the underworld. I mean, this song unwinds me. These birds lead to oneself, half in, half out of the sea. Something primal. Part water, part air breathing. Not of fin only, but also of wing. Mourning doves have sung in my head all my life. Even now they sing. I love this poem. I do. I have to say I love this poem.
I think of you as the writer there as being the mourning dove.
Oh, that's
How
interesting.
much clearer could you make it, or could the writer make it?
Well, if I write a poem about me as a mourning dove, you'll be the first to read it.
And the bonus is you can fly away whenever you want.
Good.
Never to be imprisoned again anywhere.
I can do their sound, but the words will be more difficult.
You never use the word haunting, which is how I've always characterized their primary sound.
That's a perfect word.
Yeah, and
it is
and you
haunting.
avoided it.
Well, but I felt that word without knowing it. The birds are somehow magical.
Those specific birds.
Yes. And I think for many people, I've talked to a lot of folks who just love that call.
I love that call too. I always have. It reminds me of various chapters of my life, not just my youth. And it confuses me a little bit because all of a sudden, as Jody and I made the move down to Florida, living in the Gulf region in Destin, we heard the call of a bird we've never heard before, which really confused us. And I think I recall the mourning dove sound being part of it. The sounds of the mockingbird.
Oh.
Which really confused my mind when I'm listening to it, because they mimic perfectly, at least to my ear. It sounds like a dozen different bird calls.
Yes.
Like a record, over and over again.
It's a wonderful thing to hear.
And I'm not sure how you as a poet would write about that, but I'm so glad you wrote about one particular refrain in their daily songs.
Yes.
That of the mourning dove. And because people don't have the copy or the poem before them, I would like you to read them all twice. So would you read this a second time?
Evocation. All my life mourning doves have sung in my head. Don't misunderstand, this isn't some romantic notion about lost loves or martyring myself in the ocean. No, this is Ariadne's thread. It doesn't bind, it ravels all the wrappings of the shell I wove on worldly travels in the underworld. I mean, this song unwinds me. These birds lead to oneself, half in, half out of the sea. Something primal. part water, part air breathing, not of fin only, but also of wing. Morning doves have sung in my head all my life, even now they sing.
And how long after the poem, and I'm guessing it was after rather than before, did evocation come?
About a week ago.
About a week ago?
Not the poem, the word evocation.
That's
I changed the title.
Yes, that's what
Yes,
I'm asking about.
I changed the title.
Because it's a wonderful title.
Yeah.
It fits so keenly that I wondered how quickly it came after you wrote it. And I guess it's been a while.
Generation. But I picked, this was an improvement. This shows that a poem is never finished. This is one of my mantras. A poem is never finished as long as you're capable of altering even a title.
And I'll add one line to it because my teacher impressed me with it so much. My teacher, Cahen, back in 1989, again in that little kitchen in that cottage that it used to be a pig pen at one time. A poem never ends because the poet's life never becomes fixed regarding the poem. In other words, your outlook about everything you've ever written evolves. And that if you were to go back and review perhaps 20 poems at random from the thousands you've written, you might very well pick up the pen and change half of them, meaning that they're never finished because something strikes you afresh that would cause you to do it, just like you changed the title with this.
So it's an example for me of my own conclusion that a poem is never finished as long as you have the ability and opportunity to alter it.
Yeah.
Sometimes for the worse, but very often for the better.
So this is one of your favorites. What makes a poem a favorite of Al's?
It moves me. I can gauge all my poems on that kind of scale. It moves me, and it continues to move me. I have the habit I think most writers have of being enamored of their poem or their first page of a novel or the whole novel, but that wears off, and you look at it in a different way, sometimes a week later, for a short poem. Some stay, and I treasure them, and that's one of them. I think there are a couple more in here too.
A little aside here before we move on, only because there's so much that I know about you that is of interest to me that has to do directly with poetry and indirectly with poetry and prose. And one of the things that really inspired me to carry on in Al's tradition once you left Cleveland for a while and moved to Florida was the class you facilitated, you really led it, you taught it for a number of years on Walden Pond, Thoreau's classic that spoke to so many people on so many levels in so many ways over all those years continuing through today. Where did that come from? I mean, poetry was what the one-word description would be about Al Cahen. And then out of the blue for me was Walden Pond.
Mm-hmm.
Where did that come from?
The same void that it came from for me. And it was a fireplace in a living room, isolated house on Martha's Vineyard. I had the book. I had never read it. I knew very little of Thoreau's work, and I just became totally engrossed in it.
So you went through your childhood without having read one of the classics.
Exactly, yeah.
And your
Remember, I went to engineering school. You don't read Thoreau in engineering school.
So obviously your reaction was sensational, but put it into different words after you read that.
I found the poetry in Walden. I'm sure that I have culled about 250 poems from the book, not by bringing out one or two lines that or three that are contiguous, but finding a phrase here and a phrase there, and they go together, and oh, here's another one, and pretty soon it's a poem. And I did 250 of those over the years and read the book 8 times, taught classes, you and I discussed them,
Oh, we loved it.
And that's how it happened. And I call those not found poems. That's the term now. Revealed poems.
Yeah, and they had to, and you had to be the excavator to know which area to explore for them to become revealed to you, because another 10 people might have and probably have glossed right over them, never realizing them to be poems.
That's right.
Yeah.
And his own, by the way, his own poems, which were few, were terrible. And he was one of the great prose writers.
So he didn't even know he was writing poetry that was not poetry in his mind.
No.
And what a great class that was. I mean, if you recall, not only did we, the students, maybe 8, 12, 14 of us at a time, meet every week with you as we would read this book and discuss it, but we signed up and did it again. We were repeat students.
You did it once, without me.
Well, yes, because
yes, you did in a bookstore.
You abandoned us and you left. And I thought, well, Al's not here to facilitate this. I'll facilitate it. I won't be nearly as good, but it really depended on the individual students. And I'm talking about students in their 80s, and 70s, and 60s.
And a range of interest.
Yeah. Let's move on to poem number 3.
Poem number 3. Overwhelmed. Well, that comes right out of the conversation. Overwhelmed. This utterness of night, like nothing else, but non-earthfully faithful as lovers when satisfied, and as still. Oh, yes, so still.
I want to have you read this one more time immediately.
Overwhelmed. This utterness of night, like nothing else, but non-earthfully faithful as lovers when satisfied, and as still. Oh, yes, so still.
An army of us would have lots of different views on the individual words. Guess what my favorite word is there? I mean, it's unfair to ask you to guess.
Non-earthfully.
That's a great one. That would be my second favorite. Utterness.
Utterness. Utterness of night,
The
yes.
utterness of night.
Yes, it engulfs.
So it's not channeled. Maybe it comes from this copper wire. You didn't think about it a long time ahead of time. I know you. And again, the rhetorical question is, from whence does it come? You know?
I can't answer that. There can be stimuli, but how to translate the stimuli into a printed page, a poem, is something I can't answer.
I don't think I'm revealing any secrets. My part of the revelation part of this, you're about to turn 80. You've got these thousands of poems and many more thousands of pages of prose. Your house is only so big. What are you going to do with this stuff?
Well, my son's going to devote about 10 years of his life after I'm gone trying to answer that question, because I don't think I can put much of a dent in it. But I'll do what I can. And I'll start with the present poems, not the early ones. I'll never reach the early ones.
And how many gems will you be overlooking by not turning back to the early ones?
Many fewer than you'd expect, because I do have a style now that I never had before.
Well, plus, I mean, this is my terminology. I just made it up. Wasn't there an Cahen blue period of writing poetry at one time?
Meaning?
Meaning that you had a different outlook, where your sensibility and sensitivity to the outside world maybe was a little more restricted, or a little less optimistic at one time?
Well, I'll answer it with an imaginary model, a timeline. If I could put each poem in its proper place on that timeline and ask you to read those poems in sequence, you would not believe that I, whom you know, wrote 3/4 of those poems. But I know, and I can see my life in that succession. I can feel my life in it.
Very interesting. You are the master, my word. And for another person, perhaps they'd be less generous and just say, you're a specialist in succinct poetry. I mean, really bare poetry, bare few words. And I remember a phrase you taught me decades ago when it came to pruning unnecessary words. It was called killing your darlings. Remember
Yes,
that phrase?
that's not original with me. But
Okay, but it certainly applies.
Yeah, it's great praise.
And of course, that was the hardest thing for me to ever learn to do because, well, I use 2 words when 7 will work.
So you have to cram in a lot of adjectives and adverbs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A little bit about that before we go on to the next poem. Why is the mark of a good poem? It's succinctness. It's brevity. Not always, but in probably most cases.
A very interesting question because I write mostly and increasingly brief poems in my life.
15 words, 25 words most.
Lots of haiku,
Yeah.
17 syllables. Gee. Revision is not changing words, but revising the impact of the poem, the significance, the depth of it, the feelings that it evokes. That's what makes me change words to try to not so much improve, but to be more an extension of how I feel, and sometimes autobiographically, but mostly how I feel, so that the poems at this end of the imaginary stream of poems you would not recognize at all, because I have changed. It isn't the poems that have changed first. It's
Yeah.
me,
And of course,
and the poems follow, and they follow.
day that goes by, you change.
Yes, yes.
I wasn't planning on telling this story, but I think I must because one of the many lessons I learned from you over the years, one dawned on me without any forewarning, and it just blew me away. And it was about what you were talking about just now. I discovered with the process called revision, which was the word you just used, that by writing a poem, let's say it's on this light fixture above your head. Use that word, use that idea, that term, that metaphor somewhere in a poem. You got 5 minutes to write it. Go ahead and write it. And we had exercises like that. Now turn the page over and let's talk about something else. And then 5 minutes later, you would instruct us to go back to the poem, turn it back face side up, and revise it. Add to it. Delete the title. Erase the whole thing. Start anew. Alter one word, one punctuation point. What I found was you could do that endlessly. And I have. I'm not sure if it makes the poem necessarily better or worse, but it continually refines it and distills it. And I liken that to putting a person in touch with his or her intuition. In fact, I was even so arrogant and bold and forward to conduct a class for a while when you moved to Florida on deepening our intuitive urge.
I attended one of them before I went back to Florida.
And it was all predicated
Yeah.
on the revision of the written word. How we're drawn mysteriously and silently to revise, endlessly. So I found great delight in that, and I think even though I've never been a poet of any degree of anything that I'd submit to my 4th grade poetry teacher, the process has been a revelation to me because of what I just talked about there. And you just discussed it about your poetry too. And yet I think that goes unrecognized by a lot of people I know who are pretty accomplished poets. I don't know if they're fully aware of how much they're digging deeper and deeper into their own core to revise a poem that's just waiting to be improved. It's waiting to be made more spare than it was originally.
Well, I'm going to throw back at you a question.
Mm-hmm.
You've written much prose, travel prose, that I've encountered, and your experiences with hospice.
Mm-hmm.
But when you started writing poetry, you were in another dimension.
Yeah.
How did that affect you?
Well, it wasn't an easy transition to make. In fact, it was quite intimidating. Even if you told me, Ted, you don't ever have to worry about revealing this poem to anybody else's eyes. They're yours forever. It was still an intimidating process, and I eventually learned the reason why. It is the greatest form of self-dialogue, perhaps, that there is. You are really in the process of being as honest with yourself as you can be. You can dress it up with metaphor. You can talk in all sorts of language, changing gender, changing centuries, but you're really still talking about yourself. I even came to the point one day where we had the same members of a poetry group that would meet 3 times a year for 6 or 7 weeks at a time. I said something pretty outlandish that quite a few people I found thought was, they took offense to it. And I said, this is like coming to a spiritual group for me, and people perked up and their eyebrows would arch. What do you mean by that? And it dawned on me that everybody was revealing their own unique, same story over and over. No matter how much they tried to change the subject, the topic, the era, whatever it might be, I still could see their story being unearthed more and more. I see it in yours all the time. And I saw it in quite a few other people. And I still believe that that's true. So when you ask me how that felt for me, it really was coincidental, the beginning of my spiritual inquiry, deep spiritual inquiry. When I realized that we were all given a vehicle on which we can be, at a maximum level, self-honest. And to me, it's poetry. Nobody to impress other than yourself. And what is it that you're trying to impress upon yourself? Your genuine core, who you are.
Yeah. And you get some of that revelation with maybe every poem that you write.
Definitely.
And it stays with you.
Yeah.
And it's you. A novel might not be you if you wrote one.
Yeah.
A travel book, which I've seen one of yours, is a different form. And it was very important in your life. It isn't a question of importance, it's a question of finding out more about you. That's internally.
Yeah.
You don't need anybody to tell you this or to judge or anything else like that.
I used to say, and I don't know if I can still defend this, in a group of 12 of us at a poetry gathering, if everybody threw their poem into a pile on the floor and had it not been signed, and one person read them all, we could probably make pretty intelligent guesses as to who the owner was of each poem. Less to do with their style and more to do with that indefinable element that comes through.
That's very important.
Yeah.
Because the style is easy to pinpoint.
Yeah. Let's go on.
Wait. You overwhelm me. This is about my great uncle Sal, who painted some of the things you see around here and more upstairs.
And when we're done, I'm going to take a little video tour.
Sure.
It's okay.
Sure. He didn't get much recognition in his life, unfortunately, although he lived a long life. Sal. My great uncle left his lead-cased, half-used oil paints in a colorless attic. There, one day, I found them. Joy. I wondered how many masterly paintings were still latent in those crinkled tubes. Years later, at the Tate, I saw in a glass cubicle Turner's caked palette and stained brushes. This all seemed to me as if he had been interrupted in some great unfinished work, glowing by day, black by night.
Well, that's real wonderful. Once again, we're talking about the typewriter sitting on the shelf.
Yeah.
And the little pencil stub. It's almost a tragedy, maybe an overuse of a word, to think of how many poems are not written by people who have that gift and are simply unaware of it. And I don't mean for the public, I mean for themselves. It is a different, you asked, I'm back to the question you asked before. This is maybe something you don't recall. I first met you at a poker game.
I remember it well.
And you asked about one of my hospice patients, and I said, well, you know, it's touched me as no human beings ever touched me as he is dying, and I wrote about it in my journal, and you asked to see it, and you said, Ted, that's not a journal entry, that's a poem. And I'd never heard that term ever used before. I mean, it was overly flattering for you to say that. And so you lulled me into this notion that maybe I could attend Al Cahen's poetry classes, and that's what got me started.
I remember it vividly.
Yeah.
And I told you that 3 of a kind beats a pair. So
I'm pretty gullible.
We exchanged wisdom.
Yeah, we did. That's what got me started, and I just it's been of usefulness not to anybody in this world but myself to see that you can be given, if you go to the right hardware store, a new type of spade and a new type of pick with which you can do your own inner excavation.
Nice metaphor.
Yeah, and boy, was I glad to have that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's raised in my dad's hardware store where we sold those things. I never thought they could be used for that purpose. And who among us were ever told that? And I think it's kind of a tragedy that people in this day and age, especially when the arts receding into the background so much, it seems, because of the hectic pace people live with today's technology, and think they're using self-expression when they're really skimming the surface. I wish there were more of you. Are there many people still attending the poetry group, and does it have legs to withstand all the temptations for people to find the distractions of their life to pull them away from it?
Well, the beginnings of this quickly moved to, I don't know, about 15 in the early days. It's still around 15, and I was gone for 9 of those years. Mm-hmm. And I said before I left for Florida that this group will still be here if and when I come back. It was not only some of the same faces, but the group was in fact still 14 or 15. Mm-hmm. It's a self-sustaining board of directors with no head, which makes it safe,
yeah,
and productive and unselfish. Anyway, that's.
Well, I'm glad. And I owe you a debt of gratitude for bringing me into that little loop for a while. And in fact, it's been ongoing ever since. I mean, you and I meet and we bring poems to the lunch table from mm-hmm. time to time. I don't write much beyond that, or except for that. But really, you start to see life more poetically. And I think that's the lesson that's impressed upon all of us as your students. And that's why these people stay so faithful to the cause. But so little attention seems to be paid to that subject today.
Yes. You remember the day that we were driving from lunch to St. Paul's for a mm-hmm. meeting of the group, and I saw you with a piece of paper on the horn part of your, and you were writing a poem as you drove. You had about 5 minutes because it didn't take any longer to get there, and you shared that.
Well, that's how I wrote half my poems.
It happens anywhere, for any reason.
Yeah, you don't hold this up and say, look how good I am, because nobody would ever agree with you. But again, it's back to what you do in your poetry so well. An idea comes, and then you flesh it out. Not too generously. You flesh it out with the fewest words you can, as I'm sure you've done with this next poem.
Mightily so, for me personally, not perhaps for anybody else. My granddaughter was born in 1993. The title of the poem, as I wrote it then, and I wrote it the same day I heard about her birth, the title itself is a poem. But then there's a poem below it. It's a long title. When Abigail Clare saw her first light, I, her grandfather, heard a train whistle and wept. That's the title. Longest title I ever wrote. But I went beyond that, in parentheses. This is the poem. It came whole and resists further synthesis. This is as pure as it gets. This is what pushes equations out of my head. Poor aborted things. This is a live birth, its own solution, and sings once only.
And instead of having you read the whole thing, I'd like you to read the title one more time.
When Abigail Clare saw her first light, I, her grandfather, heard a train whistle and wept.
Talk about evocative.
Well, titles, this is, remember how many times I've said titles are parts of, not only part of a poem, but significant for what will follow the title.
Sure, and they're not beyond being hatcheted away, as you did with the title of the poem you read 10 minutes ago.
Yeah.
I mean, that's beyond killing your darlings. That's killing a part of yourself when you do that.
That's good. That's good. I mean, not to kill myself, but what
Yeah.
you just said.
It must seem that way, because when you assigned that title initially, when that poem was written years ago, I'm sure it felt like the perfect fit for you.
Yeah. Oh, I did weep immediately and many times after that too, but I could have stopped the poem there.
So what is this? You who have so many ways of describing the different forms of writing poetry, is this a poem title commentary, or is this two poems? How would you describe what this poem is, with this lengthy title, which is wonderful, with this explication?
The title is a overused word and basically meaningless. It should, as I've said many times, enhance the poem that follows. It should be connected and a powerful lead-in. Don't ever say repeat from your title the first word or the first line of the poem, because then you haven't added anything from the title. So it's that simple.
And I think I've also heard you say quite a few times that they're not mandatory, they're not required.
Don't need a title. Emily Dickinson never used a title. She
Does
wrote
the
seven-
absence of a title sometimes enhance the stature of the poem?
Well, Emily wrote 1,750 poems without any title. They were just numbered by her heirs and her helpers after she died. She didn't care about titles. Her genius was astounding style and I can't even describe it. She didn't need a title. She's one of the few poets who didn't need a title.
Let's go on to the next one.
I have 3 poems of the war poems. As you know, I like to write those because wars bother me a lot. And this one is called The Great Waste, 1914 to 1918, First World War. And the Battle of the Somme was early in the war. It was terrible. It lasted for months. But on the first day of the Somme, when the generals pushed the men out of the trenches, at the end of that day, at nightfall, there were 60,000 British casualties, dead and wounded. 60,000 in less than 24 hours. That was the nature of World War I, the Great Waste. Millions went wordlessly over the top of meaningless lands and ended up with their brains inside out, their memories in their hands.
Wow. Could you ever allow yourself to be drafted into a war?
I just can't answer that question. I've often thought about it. I think I would be afraid. I think most soldiers are afraid in combat, but I would do it, or I would be drafted in those years.
Would you read that one more time?
The Great Waste, 1914-1918. Millions went wordlessly over the top of meaningless lands and ended up with their brains inside out, their memories in their hands.
You and I talk frequently about all matters of spirituality, and I thought coming over here, I'm going to refrain from doing that. That's our little private fun topic to discuss. But this poem evokes to me an element that's more spiritual than, it's so spiritual that I can't resist a comment on it. When I see these soldiers wordlessly going over the top, it evokes to me the image of what I think of in years gone by as true believer, zealot, exceptional faith, spiritual prominence. What else, as you wrote that poem and as you read that poem, accounts for men knowingly ending their lives?
Good question.
In the wars of that era, that dictated such response. Yeah. When the order was given to wordlessly go over the top.
Well, I think if those who didn't emerge, many of them got shot before they ever reached the top of the trench. The Great Waste. It was a waste, an unforgivable waste.
Same with the Civil War.
Exactly. Exactly.
You think about these questions quite obviously, and you write about them prolifically. Why? And what answers do you get?
Well, let me read the second war poem.
Okay.
And this is about Audie Murphy, who was the most decorated soldier of World War II. So we're in the second big war.
Pretty fearless.
Fearless. Fearless. Audie. Sodden with decay was Murphy's war. 30 medals weighed him down. 20 dozen of the enemy he'd killed, wounded, or captured. But the filth of it all, fear and rage, hasty burials, much grief for friends lost or in pieces. The man wrote about all that. 4 years later, and tortured, came calmer words. Came also his breakdown.
Well, the difference between Audie Murphy and many people we know from those wars is that so many people never chose to write about that. Perhaps they couldn't stave off some form of breakdown any more than Murphy did. But there's got to be some catharsis in finding the portal from which these accumulated savage attacks on our psyche can, at least in part, escape. And it sounds like he tried to do that with his writings.
He wrote a book called To Hell and Back, which was later made into a movie that he starred in.
I remember that.
He then had a 4 or 5 year movie career, quite successful, and just fell to pieces eventually, and died in a plane crash in 1971, a small plane crash, which is very ironic.
So your attraction to this subject has resulted in your own growth of understanding. Today, as you approach your 8th decade,
Thank you.
What do you make of this?
I didn't like the number, but I liked what you said.
What do you come away from when you've read this yet again to yourself about the futility of war?
That's it. The shame of it. Often the shame of it, which is on the general's shoulders.
I mean, this is 2012, and I watch daily the accounts of what's going on in Syria, and it's unfathomable. People don't even know why they're I think, shooting at one another. And it's the oldest question probably on Earth in recorded time.
Well, you've spent a lot more time than I in the context of world wars and Syrian and other upheavals. You're very connected to them, not just as a reporter, but emotionally, I can tell.
I'm trying to be less connected to them emotionally and more observing them as a witness would, as a reporter would. And I find that, for me, is my safety valve. It's actually a spiritual path that I'm trying to pursue, and it'd be very, very hard for me to explain it. But there is some solace in being a witness to the good and the evil in life from the position of a witness who sees things through the lens of equanimity, that what appears awful over the span of 1,000 years, as the lens widens out to its maximum width, may not in the end be awful at all, and the reverse with what appears to be so blessed, so good today, that in time will be revealed as being perhaps nothing of a sort. And the word that I use is equanimity, which enables me to attempt to write poetry as clearly as I can, that helps me to see all that's going on around us from a different perspective. It's a work in progress, because I'm nowhere close to nailing that down yet. But you handle this with words, and the words are so, they're like a dagger. they're so sharp. And I'd almost like you to read that a third time, if you don't mind, because...
Third?
Did you read that a second time already? Read it a second time then, because again, the one word in there that caught my attention the first time, I want to hear that again in context.
Audie. Sodden with decay was Murphy's war. 30 medals weighed him down. 20 dozen of the enemy he'd killed, wounded, or captured. But the filth of it all, fear and rage, hasty burials, much grief for friends lost or in pieces. The man wrote about all that. 4 years later, and tortured, came calmer words, came also his breakdown. That was his reward, I guess. He was still alive.
The irony in the phrase, if I remember correctly, strikes me. 30 medals weighed him down?
30 medals he had from French, American, mostly American, including the Medal of Honor and God knows.
Well, are we going to hear a Civil War poem? Because I know that is among the favorite
Actually, I
topics
didn't choose one for today, but this is another World War II poem. It's called A Ship at Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
And I'm sure everybody knows that the Arizona, after it was sunk, was in the middle of Pearl Harbor Bay, where it still is, and they built the Memorial Arch, which is implied in here. A ship at Pearl Harbor. None of us had ever been where we were told to go. It's as if we had drifted to this place on some ghost raft and shed dreams like a corpse its skin. The beautiful parts of life can be the most desolate. Oil drops still rise from the Arizona. A rainbow clock ticks of death. That's my other war poem that I brought.
And it's really focused on the element that I see so clearly that brings this value that's simply expressed as a memorial. It's the memorial that allows us to think, that allows you to think the way you just expressed it with this poignant poem.
And the skeletons and spirits of the men who were still trapped and are still trapped
Yeah.
in the hold, their message is drops of oil.
Wow.
This is scary.
Do you have any
Scary,
left?
but what?
Do you have any left?
One.
One.
I saved Ernest Hemingway for the end. I don't know if you've heard this poem or not.
I think I did.
This is about a great writer and a great adventurer, and in many ways a poor human being. Hunting, whatever you call it. It's not the first line. For Hemingway, whose quarry was always himself. Disenchanted, depressive darkness does not discourage the lion who fails and fails to catch and kill his prey. There must come, will come, did come, his one successful day.
Yes, I remember
You
this
remember
poem.
that successful day?
Yes, I remember this poem.
Yeah.
Why could his, before I have you read that a second time, why couldn't his gold-plated pick and axe and shovel end up saving him? In other words, he found the vein worth $1 billion. He had the implements to explore it. He made great headway. And in the end, it got him nowhere. I always think people who have that gift of awareness and the skill and the tools and the gifts of creativity are so much farther ahead than everyone else. Have you ever thought about why he ended up the way he did?
Many times. And I can't come up with a simple answer. His character, his experiences, his brutality, his great writing gifts, I mean, they're all part of him. And he was a nasty guy very often. Mm-hmm. Hurt a lot of people. Demeaned a lot of people. And killed himself. I don't know why. Nobody knows why. I think he thought, enough. Of what? He killed animals in Africa. He abused his fellow men, put them down. He was a nasty guy.
Let's hear a second reading.
Hunting, to Hemingway, whose quarry was always himself. Disenchanted, by the way, this is over alliteration, I was told, so listen to it.
Okay.
To Hemingway, whose quarry was always himself. Disenchanted, depressive, darkness does not discourage. The lion who fails and fails to catch and kill his prey. There must come, will come, did come, his one successful day.
Oh, jeez. The spin you put on this is just haunting. Well,
Choices.
you brought a great selection of poetry to read. I'm stirred by them every time I hear these. It's such a delight to be able to meet you for lunch at Nighttown and other places where we just while away 2.5 hours. Yep. Talking about the power of words, which I know you're so fond of, and yet you're so fond of using the fewest number of words or syllables to express an idea as keenly as can be expressed.
Syllables.
Yeah. So what's ahead for Al Cahen?
Oh, another lunch with you to keep things in the present.
I'll explore out loud, just because of my selfish interest, the hope that you and your son and others who have the ability might find a way to at least upload these to the internet so that people, when they see this interview, will have an address to turn to. I mean, if there aren't books coming out immediately, and I don't see that happening, I hope it happens, but I don't see it happening just because I know how easy it is to procrastinate over such a legacy of so many poems and so much prose. So assuming that that turns out to be the case, the second best alternative would be able to make a lot of these poems available on the internet for truly interested people to really have a chance to satisfy their interest to read them over and over again. I hope that happens one day.
Well, I hope so too, but I think that you and I need a lunch or two to talk about the pros and cons of that idea, because I have some cons. That you'll never hear a single piece of feedback.
That you
how you have related to the unknown people.
But Al, you spent the last 60 years never hearing much feedback. Yes, you have momentary opportunities 2 or 3 times a year when you sit around a table or in a church library with fellow poets. But what I'm talking about, the great number of poems that have, if I'm correct, have never been seen or read before, they've generated zero feedback. That is a con, but I don't know if that's a big enough reason not to share them. And who's to say you won't hear feedback from these? I mean, put into the hands of a person who really knows how to wield the internet pretty well.
The nice thing about your suggestion is that I can start with one poem and then go from there.
Yeah,
I've thought about this. We've talked about it. I have some trepidation, as you just heard.
Is that the sum total of your trepidation, that you wouldn't hear the feedback?
The other is I'd rather not share the poems than to be misunderstood.
Well, isn't that the risk of every poet who's ever lived?
Every writer.
How do you?
Every writer.
Let me use a word that's used in poetry sometimes. Don't take this the wrong way. Is that not arrogant of the poet?
Yes, it is. It's a desire to hoard and to keep, and a fear that it will be rejected.
And of all the books, of all the great poets and lesser poets who have committed their work to the printed page, they've somehow learned to overcome that fear of having their work misunderstood.
Yes, many.
But that's still a problem. You don't want it to be misunderstood.
Emily Dickinson had her way of avoiding hurt.
She didn't share them.
She didn't share them. In fact, she hid them under the floorboards, and in fact didn't title them. And somebody else, 2 of her friends, important people in her life, butchered them in translation. It just butchered them because they didn't understand her genius.
Wow. Well, how about this? Let's strike a compromise if you're open to it, and if you're not, just say so. My battery's running out, and so is our...
So is mine.
That's why I paused there. How about if at the end of this video, which is now about 1 hour and 10 minutes long, I simply say, after hearing what you and I just discussed, I'll put an email address up to which they can respond to you if anybody has an interest in either lending a helping hand to make these poems available to people.
I'd like that.
And then you could weigh their reactions and their suggestions.
I would like that. Thank you. That'd be great.
Al, this has been wonderful. Thanks a whole lot.
Wonderful hour and 10 minutes.
Thank you.
These paintings belong together. I call them a diptych because they complement each other in their own ways. I did the white one first and the black background second, and I realized that they should go side by side. And then I saw shapes, almost a human shape here, and here I saw explosions and shells, and suddenly I said, this is World War I. These are paintings right out of World War I. And what did I name them? The name's not important.
No.
I am a devotee of Jackson Pollock, and not to imitate him, I thought one day I would like to honor him. And I didn't want all the colors that he used in his great paintings. So I decided to use only neutral colors, black, white, and gray. And I've played around with this before, and I thought that the finished product is something that he could identify with. And I didn't put my name on it. And
why is that?
Well, because I want to call it homage to Jackson Pollock, but that wouldn't be appropriate on the corner. Maybe on the back. Maybe I will sign it. It's never too late to sign a painting.
Now, I love the room you live your life in. Give me a little running tour of your cave, of your workspace down here in the basement of your home.
So-called man cave.
Uh-huh.
Well, all of these paintings are ones that I created or made. And by the way, you might want to take a look at this, because this is probably the most scary and violent painting I've ever made, and most people can't look at it more than 10 seconds because it frightens them.
War of the Worlds pops into my mind.
There you go. It's just a very strange painting. The rest of the room is devoted to, this is the Lincoln Wall, or the Civil War wall, with some Confederate envelopes, Confederate money, some wonderful etchings of Lincoln and family, a couple of authentic Civil War.
I'm studying profiles here between you and Lincoln. He's not your great-great-grandfather, is he?
People have said that since I was, I'll never forget going with a bunch of school children on a tour in a field, and one of the little girls, who happened to be black, looked up at me and said, "You're Abe Lincoln." This is an interesting picture because it's the day I kidnapped my son. Doesn't it look like I kidnapped him?
Looks like you wanted in at least 12 states.
Exactly. And these are books that my grandfather, he went to London. He walked from Poland to London when he was 14 years old.
Boy.
And became a book.
Is this your grandfather up in the upper right-hand corner up here?
That's my father to the left, and my mother's father to the right.
And this part of the room?
Well, it's the first time in my life that I've been able to put really the bulk of my library in one place.
And I'm sure there's still books unpacked.
Yeah, and these are books in the glass cases that are more valuable.
And are all your poems here? Okay, light back there? There they are.
Answer.
Wow.
I don't know what you're supposed to
I am.
These are miniature sculptures, but there's nothing holding these rocks together. These are all made by simply balancing them.
So these don't move to another showcase anywhere?
No.
This is their ultimate
Photographs
showcase.
of them, that's about all I can do. But I love, and I do this on a bigger scale out in the patio in nice weather. I build.
Well, this is quite poetic all by itself.
It's lots of fun.
It's temporary art.
Transient art.
Transient art.
Yes, transient art, and then I can rebuild them in another format or whatever.
Al, this has been great. Thank you so much for allowing me to inhabit your cave for a while.
But now you see the job I have with poetry.
Yeah.
And why I'm avoiding it because it's
Let's end this on a note that I think I first heard from my buddy Al Cahen about situations like this that are sort of imponderable. More will be revealed.
And was today, I think.
Thanks.